Welcome to your lecture on the neural and hormonal systems of the human body. The neuron is going to be the building block for your nervous system. When we talk about neurons and we talk about nerves, we're essentially talking about the same thing. Now, neurons and nerves come in a variety of types and shapes, but we're going to talk about the most basic. The purpose of a neuron is to receive, integrate, and to transmit information. It's going to receive information through the dendrites, it's going to integrate all that information, and it will transmit information through its axon end. What you guys should be able to do at the end of this lecture is be able to tell me the structure and the function of the different aspects of a basic neuron. Tell me about how it fires properly. Tell me what the basic neurotransmitters are that we'll talk about. What happens if you have too much or too little of a neurotransmitter? And then a basic description of the other system in our body that helps integrate and send messages, which is going to be our hormonal system. This is the basic neuron that we're going to be looking at. You need to know how the neural impulse flows, and it always goes from left to right as far as this neuron is set up. In other words, dendrite end to axon end. If we were to flip the picture, it will always go dendrite end to axon end. So what does that mean? Well, the soma is going to be your basic cell body. It's going to control or contain the nucleus and all of the other kind of common machinery that you see in a neuron or a cell, any cell in your body. The soma is also going to have dendrites that branch from it. These dendrites are going to receive stimulation, messages from other nerve cells. The messages come in the form of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters would be released from a nearby cell. Those neurotransmitters will actually impact or just briefly touch the dendrites. They don't get absorbed, they don't go into the next cell. It's more like a high five. They get stimulation and then the thing that causes stimulation goes away. So if anyone's ever given you a high five before, you didn't take their hand with you, it didn't become part of you, they got to keep their hand. And that's kind of what neurotransmitters do. They just give the dendrite information. They give it a bit of stimulation, and that stimulation is then collected by the cell body. If the cell body determines that it's received enough stimulation, it will then generate an electric signal in the axon. This electric signal is going to be called your action potential. That electric signal will travel down the length of the axon. Now, just to be clear, the axon starts right at the base of the soma and continues all the way to the far right of your screen where you see the little yellow branches. That's still part of the axon. The electrical signal will travel all the way down the axon, and when it gets to the very end, its terminal branches, terminal meaning end, it's going to actually come into contact with these orbs filled with neurotransmitters. We'll call them vesicles. The electrical signal will push the vesicle, this orb, into the cell wall, causing the vesicle to rupture and the cell wall. And it allowed the neurotransmitters, the specific neurotransmitters, to then spill into an area called the synapse. It will then impact the next neuron in the chain of events, and later it will receive all of its neurotransmitters back. So, like a high five, kind of think of the terminal buttons as the hand. The neurotransmitters are your stimulation. They always come back home. Again, we're looking at another basic or typical neuron. And again, it's always going to flow dendrite to axon. If it helps, if you think dendrite, cell body, axon, D, C, B, A, it always flows in the reverse of the alphabet. May or may not help. You may have noticed in the previous picture that the axon had a bunch of kind of ovals surrounding it. Well, this is actually your myelin sheath, and myelin sheath is something that you grow. Myelin sheath covers the axon in some of our neurons, but not all of them, and it allows for the cell to fire much more quickly. Now, the dendrite end receives chemical stimulation, and that's going to be in the form of neurotransmitters. However, the axon end sends an electrical charge, like true electricity that could power a light bulb. Now, when we look at our cords for our computers or any kind of electrical cord, they're always encased in plastic or rubber, and we know it's to keep us from getting electrocuted, but it also condenses the electrical message. It makes it go exactly where it is supposed to go, to the outlet. It keeps it from spreading or dissipating. And so this fatty layer actually increases the speed at which our neurons can fire. Now you may be asking, why do we want neurons that fire a little bit more slowly? When we start talking about pain messages, that'll kind of make more sense. But sometimes a really quick message that says, hey, you broke your ankle is important. Sometimes a slower message that says your ankle is throbbing is important to remind you to stay off of it. Nodes of Reindeer are going to be important, but not for testing purposes, just so you kind of understand the machinery of the cell. It allows sodium and potassium to flow inside and out of the axon. And when we talk about the sodium-potassium pump, it's necessary that this happens. At the very end of the axon, if you could just imagine on the very far right side of your screen that there was another neuron with dendrites branching out and trying to reach the axon. The space between the axon terminal and the dendrites, just this space where they could send messages back and forth, that's called the synapse. We'll talk about things being presynaptic and postsynaptic. We're going to be using the idea of a synapse, this junction or space between two neurons, really as an anchor point. It's where they communicate. And for us, if I tell you something, we're talking about the presynaptic side, we're talking about before the synapse, we're talking about the axon end. If we're talking about the postsynaptic side, after the synapse, we're talking about the dendrite end. And it has to do, again, with the direction in which neurons fire. Dendrite, cell body, axon. Really quick review. Do you know the basic parts of the neuron? Dendrite, cell body or soma, axon, terminal buttons, myelin sheath, synapse. In which direction does the neuron fire? From which end to which end? What is the purpose of all of those different structures? It used to be thought that the brain was made up of neurons and just fatty tissue that was there to hold these neurons in place, basically structural support, and they were known as glia cells. Now, we still have glia cells, but as we learn more, we realize that these cells are far more than just structural support for our neurons. They outnumber our neurons 10 to 1, and they make up over half of the brain's bulk. Now, these cells have some pretty important roles, and more than what are just listed here. But they help manufacture and release chemicals that may help or maintain synaptic transmissions. We know that it nourishes the brain. In other words, it helps oxygen and glucose go between our blood supply and our neurons, since there's no real direct blood on the brain. It also will be the cells that will create the myelin sheath that helps for the speedy firing. And even though we don't think about it, all cells in the body produce waste. And so something has to shuttle this out. And the glia cells help shuttle out a lot of the waste. The other thing that we've learned from glia cells is that they may actually spur on neural firing. And some of you guys may have heard of a disorder called fibromyalgia, where people have pain, but the pain isn't caused by any environmental thing, but they're still feeling pain. Well, it used to be that people thought this was something people were making up for attention. And then we found out that the glia cells were actively firing. They were causing surrounding cells to react. And what they were doing is they were actually making pain messages go to the brain. So you don't actually have to have something injured to feel pain. You just have to have the right part of the brain stimulated. And these were causing that stimulation, and people were having legitimate pain even though there was no physical trauma. There are 3 types of neurons. And while this is a little out of order, I'm hoping that most of you guys know that you have 2 major nervous systems in your body. Your central nervous system, comprised of your brain and your spinal column, and then your peripheral nervous system. We're going to talk about 3 classes of neurons, 2 of which will be part of your peripheral nervous system, and one that's exclusively in your central nervous system. If you've ever had a reflex, and I think all of us have, touched a hot stove, stepped on something sharp, even went and got a physical and had the doctor hit your patellar tendon right below your kneecap. For your brain to react, or for your spinal column to react in that fact, you would have to actually sense the information first. So we have a class of neurons called sensory neurons, and they go to the periphery of our body, therefore they're part of our peripheral nervous system. They carry messages from our sense organs to our brain and our spinal column. So this literally is our sense of touch, and they're also known as your afferent neurons. For the purposes of this class, you need to know them as sensory and you need to know them as afferent. Now, the motor neurons are your efferent, and I know afferent and efferent are very close together. Well, This just, an easy way to remember this is you have to have A before E, and I know I'm doing a lot of alphabet stuff, but you have to have an affect, a feeling, before you can make an effect or a change. That might help. But these sensory neurons, they carry messages to your spinal column in your brain. Now, if a reflex is necessary, that message may not reach the brain first before the body reacts. And you have these really cool cells called interneurons. They exist in your central nervous system, your brain and your spinal column. They will actually react to sensory messages and will cause reflexes if necessary. So if you touch a hot cookie sheet, your afferent cells are going to send a message, and that message is going to go all the way up your arm and get to your spinal column first. The amount of damage that could happen by holding on to something that is actually scorching your skin can be pretty quick and pretty bad. So instead of waiting for your brain to interpret the message, these interneurons are going to immediately cause a reaction from your motor neurons, and the motor neurons, or your efferent neurons, also part of your peripheral nervous system, will carry this message away from your brain and your spinal column to your muscles and glands. If it's coming or carrying them to your muscles, it's going to cause your muscles to react, and in reacting, they're going to pull your hand off of the hot object. This is that entire reflex, just looked at in a much more simple form. So your afferent neuron, your sensory neuron, gets stimulation. It sends that impulse to the spinal column. The spinal column, the interneuron itself, determines that this is a reflex that should happen, and it stimulates the motor neuron, or the efferent neuron. The efferent neuron causes your quadricep to twitch or to actually contract, causing your foot to kick out. This is also known as your reflex arc. You should know the 3 different cells to this and how they impact or cause this change. So here's your quick review. What were the 3 nerves involved in a reflex? Which division of the nervous system do they fall under? Which one were part of the central nervous system, and which ones were part of the peripheral nervous system? Do you know the common or the kind of general term for them, but do you also know the proper name for those neurons? We're now getting into the difficult concept of how neurons fire, and we'll try to make it fairly simple. Remember, dendrites receive, the cell body interprets, the axon generates an electrical charge, and it causes neurotransmitters to be released. Those neurotransmitters go to the dendrites of a next cell through the synapse, which is just a space. It's going to stimulate those dendrites. The cell body is going to interpret. It's going to cause an electrical charge in the axon. The electrical charge will travel down the axon and push out neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters will go on to stimulate the next cell. Once stimulation happens, the neurotransmitters are released and they're brought back into the axon of the original sending cell. Now, I know none of this really makes a whole lot of sense, and I will upload a second video that kind of breaks this down a little bit more in a very simplistic way, but we'll talk through the steps in the next couple of slides. So, how do neurons work? Well, dendrites pass incoming messages to the central part of the neuron, to the soma. And the soma has 2 choices. It can either fire, which is an action potential and electric charge, or it might get inhibited and not fire. It's important to talk about the synaptic cleft again, and I will be using presynaptic and postsynaptic terms like I discussed earlier. Again, the synaptic cleft is where a dendrite and an axon to the naked eye look like they're touching, but there's actually a microscopic gap between them. And it's an area where neurotransmitters, chemicals that actually carry information or messages, can travel between the 2 structures. The neurotransmitters are going to be stored in the synaptic vesicles. The neurotransmitters are stored in the axons, in the terminal buttons, the terminal ends of the axon. They're stored there and they're released from there. So they are released out into a synapse to bind with the dendrite. And then those very same neurotransmitters go back home to the exact same axon that had sent them out. If you're taking notes, I usually suggest people split their notes into 3 sections for this. There are 3 major divisions in neural firing. There's a resting potential, the action potential, and what's known as a refractory period. First, we're going to discuss the resting potential. It's important to know that when a nerve cell is at rest, the interior of the cell is slightly negatively charged, and the exterior is slightly positive. This imbalance causes potential energy. So, both the inside and the outside, the neuron fluids contain electrically charged ions, sodium, potassium. Those are the major ones that we talk about. During cellular firing, those ions flow back and forth across the cell membrane and at different rates. The difference in the rates that these ions flow back and forth always causes an imbalance. And as any part of your body tries to reach homeostasis, this imbalance causes a wave-like motion within the cell because it literally is like a fluid-like wave going in and out of the cell body. The most important thing to note about resting potential, while everything is primed to fire, there is an imbalance in the axon. The exterior is slightly positive, the interior is slightly negative. And again, we're just kind of looking at it. This isn't my favorite slide, but it's just this idea that the inside of the neuron is going to be different than the exterior. We're going to look at how it all starts. It all starts with a message. Any message has to come from neurotransmitters coming from a sending cell. What does that look like? Here we have a presynaptic cell. Now, if you were looking at a big picture, this would be the terminal button or the terminal end of an axon. So those far right side of the screen, little yellow ends with the bulbs on them, that's what you're looking at here. So inside each one of those little bulbs at the very end are housed synaptic vesicles. These synaptic vesicles contain neurotransmitters. When a nerve impulse or an action potential reaches the terminal button, it actually pushes these vesicles into the cell wall and they rupture. So here starts the message. These neurotransmitters are released and they then go to a postsynaptic cell. They momentarily bind at the dendrite end. The dendrite end gets stimulation and it will release these neurotransmitters. They're not absorbed, they're released. So like I told you guys before, like a high five, the stimulation happens, but then the neurotransmitter, the thing that causes stimulation, it goes back home. So it will go back into the presynaptic cell or the axon end. Those appropriately shaped neurotransmitters will dock at receptor sites on the dendrite of the postsynaptic membrane. And like I told you, that's where they are going to stimulate the receiving cell. All of that stimulation is going to be sent to the soma or the cell body. So I've said lock and key several times. Those neurotransmitters affect a change. They give you stimulation. They're the key that unlocks the message. But you may take your keys out of your pocket to unlock the door, but you always put your keys back in your pocket. Neurotransmitters may unlock the dendrite, give it stimulation, but they always go back to the axon. That is incredibly important to remember. All of that stimulation goes to the soma or the cell body. And here's where we have something called postsynaptic potential. So, a voltage change at receptor sites on the postsynaptic cell membrane. Those dendrites are receiving all of this information and they're sending information to the soma. The activation at the dendrite ends is your postsynaptic potential. It will either cause the cell to fire or inhibit it from firing. And we'll say that this is a graded change, that the charges vary in size and they increase or decrease the probability of an impulse in the cell happening. The dendrites and the soma are part of this postsynaptic potential. The dendrites receive stimulation, and once the cell body reaches a threshold, it will either fire or it won't. Here again, you get a better kind of look at the presynaptic and the postsynaptic. And again, synapses, microscopic gaps, so they look like they're touching, but here you have the axon end at the terminal buttons kind of blown up, and you have the dendrite or the receiving with the receptor sites also blown up here at the bottom. And what you should see is that specific neurotransmitters dock at specific dendrite sites, and they will give a stimulation. They will start that postsynaptic potential. Here's your second division of your paper, the action potential. Now, the nice thing about the action potential and the law that it follows is that the action potential happens in the axon, and it's based on something called the all or none principle or the all or none law. All of the A's go together. So, your soma, your cell body, has reached its threshold and it generates an action potential, which is an electrical charge in the axon. So that long extension that comes off of the soma, that's your axon, and that is going to generate an electrical charge. The electrical charge will travel down the axon, and as that electrical charge happens, there are voltage-gated channels along the axon. And I told you guys before that nodes of reindeer would be important, and here's where they become important. Those voltage-gated, electrically charged channels, when they get the action potential, they open, and sodium and potassium ions rush in and out of the cell, trying to establish a balance, homeostasis. And it can't be done. So the electrical charge travels, and the sodium and potassium ions cause a wave-like motion throughout the cell. This wave-like motion actually pushes the electrical charge even faster down the axon. So, once all of this happens, the electrical charge will come to the very end, and it will get to the terminal buttons of the cell. Those terminal buttons hold all of those vesicles that have all the neurotransmitters. The electrical charge will cause the vesicle to go into the cell wall. It will rupture and spill out neurotransmitters to continue the chain reaction into the next cell. What does the all or none law state? The action potential in the axon will either fire or it won't. There's no such thing as a weak firing of a nerve cell. The best example for this is that it does fire much like a gun. So if you've fired a Nerf gun or even a real gun, when you pull the trigger back, if you pull it back fast or you pull back nice and slow, it doesn't affect how fast the bullet comes out or the pellet or whatever it might be. They come out at the exact same firing. They will fire the same strength every single time. Now the question is, why is it then that some things feel more intense than others? It's not the strength of firing, it's the rate at which they're fired. So rate of firing, if it's something is firing like fire, 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 the cumulative response by the brain is this is intense. If it's fire, 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 the rate at which it fires, the cumulative response for the brain is like, not so intense. Neurons can convey information about the strength of a stimulus by varying the rate, but the strength will always be the same. Here again, you're seeing the slightly negative interior to the slightly positive exterior within the cell, and now you're also seeing what's called the sodium-potassium pump. As sodium and potassium moves in and out of that cell body, the sodium-potassium pump is going to react behind the wave and try to redistribute the sodium-potassium back to its original resting state. So, we have the dendrites get stimulated, the cell body will get to its graded threshold, and that entire postsynaptic potential happens. It says fire, and the all or nothing principle says that the axon will generate an electrical impulse and it will fire at the same strength every single time. That electrical impulse will start to travel down the cell, and sodium and potassium ions will move in and out of the cell, causing a wave, pushing the electrical signal like a body surfer all the way down the axon. When it gets to the end, it will push synaptic vesicles into the cell wall of the terminal buttons of the neuron. The wall will rupture, neurotransmitters will spill out, and they will then bind at specific receptor sites on the next dendrite end of another cell. After a cell fires, there has to be a time to reset. All of those neurotransmitters have to be reabsorbed back into the axon end. The sodium-potassium pump has to be given a chance to put sodium and potassium back where it belongs. Everything needs a chance to reset. During this time, it's called the absolute refractory period. Think of the absolute reset period, the absolute minimum length of time. And this is going to be frustrating because in psychology, when we talk about absolutes, we're usually talking about minimums. The absolute minimum amount of time before the cell can fire again. And it's usually a relatively short amount of time, 1 to 2 milliseconds. You may have a relative refractory period where the neuron can't fire, but the threshold for firing is elevated, so the more intense stimulation is required. All this means is that in some cases, if it's really, really bad, or the message really needs to be sent, if it has enough, like an overwhelming amount of neurotransmitters, it might be able to fire a shade quicker. But just know the absolute refractory period. This is the minimum time when we're actually trying to reset the entire cell. During this refractory period, and this is that third section that you guys should be looking at in your notes if you were taking notes with this, you have also something called reuptake. Reuptake is the process where neurotransmitters are released from the dendrites and they are reabsorbed into the actual axon that had sent them. So they go back into their home. And I told you guys before, like a lock and a key, the key stimulates the dendrite, but the key goes back in your pocket where you took it from. In other words, the dendrites release the neurotransmitters and they go right back into the axons. Now, one thing might happen. If they are not all taken back up in the process of reuptake back into the presynaptic membrane, or otherwise the terminal buttons of the axon end, enzymes might actually metabolize them. They might become waste. And again, glia cells would then take the metabolized waste from the enzymes and shuttle them out through your circulatory system. But we don't want excess neurotransmitters floating around our brain. That can lead to some pretty bad stuff that we'll talk about when we talk about the purpose of the different neurotransmitters. Here again, we're talking about that process of reuptake. So presynaptic, we're talking about an axon. Postsynaptic, we're talking about a dendrite. Presynaptic, the presynaptic neuron. Okay, so action potential, the electrical signal, pushes into those vesicles. The vesicles hit the cell wall, they rupture, they send out neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters dock at the dendrite receives stimulation, sends the stimulation to the soma or the cell body. The postsynaptic potential decides whether or not it's reached its threshold, and it will start something entirely new on this cell that's far off to your right side. While all of that's going on, the dendrite is releasing these neurotransmitters because the cell on the left side is going through the process of reuptake. It is in its refractory period. It's resetting. The sodium-potassium pump is putting sodium and potassium back to get the axon back to its resting state, slightly negative to the interior, slightly positive to the exterior. The neurotransmitters are being reabsorbed back into their vesicles, and the entire cell is getting reset. Now, at the very bottom, you see a stray neurotransmitter that didn't get reabsorbed. The enzyme is destroying that neurotransmitter. So a couple of examples that you can use just to kind of think about this. If you've ever set up dominoes, when all of the dominoes are set up, it's at its resting state. It has the potential to fire. It's just waiting for that spark. If you think about the cell, when it's slightly negative in the interior, slightly positive to the exterior, it's waiting for that neurotransmitter to start the entire chain reaction. When it's in action, we're talking about our action potential. All the dominoes are falling down, and for your cell, it's when all the pieces are moving. So an electrical signal, the action potential is generated in the axon. It fires completely because of the all or none principle at the exact same strength. Now the rate of firing might change, but the strength is always the same. Sodium and potassium ions start moving in and out. The electrical signal travels all the way down. It hits the synaptic vesicles, pushes them into the wall. New neurotransmitters spill out into the next synapse. And then everything needs to get reset. So once you knock down your dominoes, it'll take a minute or two to set them back up. Same thing with your cell. Now that those neurotransmitters have spilled out, they need to be reabsorbed back in through the process of reuptake during your refractory period. The sodium-potassium pump has to redistribute sodium and potassium ions. All that stuff has to get set back up, and it'll take about 1 to 2 milliseconds, and then it can fire again. Same thing if you want to use a toilet. When you approach the toilet, it's ready to fire. You have to use the toilet and hit the actual handle to make it flush. That would be your action potential. Once a toilet has been flushed, it can't flush immediately. It needs time to refill. And just kind of think about it that way if it helps. Review for this. So what were the 3 stages of firing? What does a neuron at rest look like? What do the neurotransmitters actually do? What happens to them when they complete their task? Where do they go once they're done? What is the action potential? Definitely know where the action potential takes place. And really, what are the rules that govern neural firing, specifically the all or none principle. We're going to talk about common neurotransmitters. Now, there are hundreds of neurotransmitters. You need to know the basic, which is roughly around 8. The first couple that we're going to talk about are called the monoamines. You don't need to know that term, but they're the ones that really seem to regulate most of our daily activities. The first one we'll talk about is dopamine. Dopamine, it's incredibly important that you know its relationship with the following disorders, but even more important that you understand what it does. Dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. Anything that produces sensations of pleasure or reward in your central nervous system is going to release dopamine. It's our addictive neurotransmitter. It's our remember that you liked it neurotransmitter. It's a very important neurotransmitter, but it's also one that can almost feel like it corrupts us. So dopamine's released anytime we make human-to-human connections, but that includes the chime on your phone. And when we talk about people possibly being addicted to their phones, it might be that their brain releases dopamine every time they look. And as long as there's a little red one next to something, or there was a chime that went off on their phone, even if it's junk mail, it releases a little bit of dopamine. So just be careful. Dopamine, if we have too much of it, can cause schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is going to be a disorder that is marked by hallucinations and delusions. This is not multiple personalities, and we'll talk about that when we get to abnormal psych, but it is definitely not that. Delusions and hallucinations, and it's an and/or. But excess dopamine may cause or stimulate the delusions and hallucinations that are marking schizophrenia, and we know that there's an excess amount of dopamine in schizophrenics. Lack of dopamine, however, because it's involved with voluntary movement when you choose to move your body, lack of dopamine is actually going to be a mark for Parkinson's disease. So when people have tremors or the inability to hold their limbs still, and it's a degenerative disease, it's usually due to a lack of dopamine. Serotonin is our happy neurotransmitter, and that's usually the easiest way to kind of talk about it. Now, it helps regulate sleep, dreaming, but the ones that I really want you to kind of pick up on is it's very, very tied into our moods, how happy we are. Now, if you meet someone with depression, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're lacking serotonin, but people with major depressive disorder usually do have low serotonin. People with OCD may have excess serotonin. In other words, they may actually have more serotonin that gets them to kind of almost over-focus on things. And you may have an imbalance of serotonin with other anxiety disorders, usually an excess of serotonin. But I want you to look at serotonin and tie it mostly into depression, but know that this is the thing that keeps us in a good mood or kind of makes us feel balanced. The last of the monoamines that we're going to talk about is norepinephrine. And this one is going to actually be utilized by our autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the system in your body that puts you into fight or flight. This one is going to help with really your heart rate, sleep, stress, sexual responsiveness, vigilance, appetite. But when we talk norepinephrine, this is actually going to be a neurochemical, a neurohormone. So it's used by the brain, but it's also going to be used by your peripheral nervous system. So two different kind of neural systems in the body will use this. This one tied in mostly to fight or flight. And again, the other things below, don't worry so much about depression. Keep depression with serotonin. Acetylcholine. I would say about 80% of the tests have a question about acetylcholine on it because most people just kind of bypass it. Now, acetylcholine is not necessarily something that you guys want to say in class because everyone feels like they're going to mess it up, but this is used by your efferent neurons. Now, remember, we talked about afferent and efferent neurons. Your efferent neurons, they're going to be motor neurons. So, primarily used by your efferent neurons carrying messages to the central nervous system. A lack of acetylcholine is actually a marker for Alzheimer's disease. When we look at this one, and that's one that I want you guys to kind of really focus on, is if we're talking about any disorder that lacks acetylcholine, it's Alzheimer's disease. And we'll talk specifically about what Alzheimer's disease is. Alzheimer's disease and dementia are not the same thing. People commonly treat them as the same. It's completely wrong. But people with Alzheimer's disease, because they lack acetylcholine, not only does it impact their memory, but eventually it impacts their ability to physically move, and you can die from Alzheimer's disease. Acetylcholine, since it has to do with your motor neurons, is also tied into other muscular disorders. Next one that we want to talk about, endorphins. Now, I told you guys that dopamine is your kind of like pleasure reminder. Endorphins are a little bit different. These are going to be your natural painkillers. And so they act like natural opiates. You have a system in your brain that is meant to help reduce pain. So endorphins, they give you pleasure sensations, but their pleasure sensations are essentially to help control pain. So when you have, or if you've ever met somebody, and hopefully you haven't, or if you've ever had to for surgery, taken an opiate, it actually reduces the amount of endorphins that your brain produces, which is why many people get so hooked on this drug, not just because of the sensation, but also because their brain stops producing their natural painkillers. So you are kind of supplementing. So you want to produce your own endorphins. If you've ever met somebody who's a huge runner, if you've ever heard of running through the wall or running through the pain, and people all of a sudden get floaty and euphoric, a runner's high, it's because their brain just essentially decided, whoa, this person's not stopping, they're going to cramp, everything's going to hurt. Well, let's just kind of flood the body with these painkillers. They literally get high off their own brain chemicals. You do have to run like I don't know, like a marathon's worth of running. But I mean, if you're going to do it, you deserve, to at least feel less pain at the end. GABA and glutamate. People always bypass these, and I'm not sure why, but I had a student a couple years ago go, GABA goes against brain activity. Now that's not what it stands for, but GABA is going to be an inhibitory neurotransmitter. In other words, it's going to be sent and it's going to tell your brain not to fire messages. So you want to know this as your primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Glutamate, this is your primary excitatory neurotransmitter. So glutamate, it's like sugar for the brain, and it's not. It's a neurotransmitter, but just think glucose, glutamate, okay, so it makes things fire. Often when we're releasing other neurotransmitters like dopamine, glutamate will get released alongside it to enhance the sending of the message. GABA, inhibitory, glutamate, excitatory. GABA prevents neural firing, glutamate enhances, spurs on neural firing. Both of these are going to be active in your central nervous system, brain, spinal column. Just another little chart for you guys to study. It tells you what the malfunctions are and really just the basic functions. I will continually test you guys on neurotransmitters, so be prepared with this. Neurotransmitters, I told you guys, already fit like lock and keys into the dendrite end. And here you're just seeing a dendrite, so you're looking at postsynaptic cells. You're looking at a neurotransmitter that is bound perfectly to the receptor site. Once that happens, stimulation is going to happen. Sometimes we will take drugs to either mimic or to block neurotransmitters. So an antagonist is going to be a molecule, think of a drug, that inhibits or prevents a neurotransmitter from reaching its receptor site. The entire purpose is to prevent that neurotransmitter from reaching. So Curare paralyzes its victims by blocking acetylcholine receptors involved in muscle movement. If you take that drug, acetylcholine cannot reach the receptor sites that allow your muscles to move. It blocks it. So no stimulation, no muscle movement. An agonist, however, is going to be a drug or a molecule that will actually mimic. It'll excite neurotransmission. So when we look at the example that you have here, black widow spider venom mimics acetylcholine, and so it stimulates receptors in the brains for movement, which causes the convulsions. It causes the motion, it causes the motor movement. So this one mimics. But we'll also take drugs that mimic other neurotransmitters if our body's not producing them. So, quick review. Can you name all the neurotransmitters? Do you know which disorders are associated with them? What were the two classifications of drugs that we discussed, and how do they impact neural firing? I will say that your review packet is a really good resource when it comes to knowing your neurotransmitters. There's another chart in there to help you review. This is the last bit that we have to talk about, the divisions of the nervous system. You'll have your central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. Your spinal cord helps with reflexes. They don't necessarily require your brain to be active. Your brain is going to be required for your choice movement, your voluntary movement. We already talked about this entire reflex arc. Remember, we talked about the fact that if you touch something really hot with your finger, your afferent sensory neurons are going to send a message to your spinal column. Your interneurons, which are part of your central nervous system, they're going to interpret the message, and they're going to stimulate your efferent nerves. So your motor nerves are going to get a message, and they're going to come back and they're going to cause your muscles to contract. Later, that message will make it to the brain, but you'll probably have moved before your brain interprets it. That's that reflex arc one more time. That's all you needed to know for the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is a little bit more developed. Not that it's more important, there's just more levels to it, I guess. All parts of the nervous system that don't exist in the central nervous system are part of your peripheral. So if you've ever wondered why you have pins and needles feelings, like when your arm falls asleep, click on the video, it'll explain that. You have two divisions of your peripheral nervous system. So all of those nerves laying outside of your brain and your spinal column, they have an important kind of job to do. So we already talked about one. Your peripheral nervous system goes into your somatic division or your autonomic division. Somatic and autonomic are the two divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Your somatic division, that's your reflex arc. That's your afferent, your sensory, your motor nerves. So they send information to your central nervous system, and it will receive information like voluntary messages to move your muscles. Your afferent, those are your sensory nerves, send sensory information to your central nervous system. Your efferent system is going to be your motor nerves. They receive information to move your body either from your spinal column or your brain. Again, central nervous system. Your autonomic division is going to be the other division of your peripheral nervous system. So the first one was your somatic, and now we're talking about your autonomic. And people often remember autonomic is automatic. So this division then breaks down into your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. Your sympathetic division is what gets you ready for fight or flight. Your parasympathetic calms you back down. So the autonomic division of your peripheral nervous system actually stimulates internal organs and glands. Here it is all broken down. So you have your nervous system. In the green, you have your central nervous system, brain, spinal column. Lovely guy over here in the green, you see that little green brain spinal column? That's it. Peripheral, everything outside of your brain and spinal column, literally to the periphery of it. Your peripheral then breaks down into your autonomic and your somatic. Your autonomic then breaks down into your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. Don't think sympathetic and sad. Think sympathetic like I can sympathize with this situation. So if a lion is coming at me, I can sympathize with the fact that I should be scared out of my mind. If a kitty cat comes charging at me, I should sympathize with the fact that it's probably cute and adorable. Parasympathetic should calm me down or should keep me at a relatively calm state. So we're going to talk about autonomic a little bit more because you do need to know the difference. So here when we're looking at these two different situations, they both probably would cause fight or flight. Now one is bad because it's terrifying and it's a shark, and the other one is exciting, but it's still going to cause you to go into a sympathetic response. So if you can sympathize with either of those, the excitement or the terror, that's sympathetic division. Okay, so fight or flight. Are you ready to fight for your life or are you ready to flee? This is going to send messages to your internal glands and organs that help you respond to stressful or emergency situations. This is going to be what will get triggered that causes you to have the pounding heart and the kind of quick breaths after you almost hit something with a car. Or you came to a quick stop, or you weren't ready for something, or when someone jumps up behind you and yells boo. It's your sympathetic division that takes that on. Your parasympathetic, like a parachute, parachute, will actually bring you back down slowly. So it's going to return the internal organs and glands back to their normal, calmer functioning. Now, this will take time for certain things, and we'll talk about that in the very next slide. You should know the ups and downs of all of these, and I know it seems like a lot, but just think about this. Anything that expels energy but will not keep you alive basically gets shut down. So when you get into a sympathetic state, your pupils dilate. You want to take in as much light so you can react. Your heart is going to increase its beating. It's going to want to pump blood throughout your body, giving it oxygen and glucose. your stomach is going to shut off. No one cares if you digest if you're dead, so it's just going to put itself on pause. Your liver is going to start to release glucose, sugar. Your adrenal glands, it's going to start to secrete epinephrine and adrenaline. Your bladder will relax. Now, not everyone who goes into a state of fight or flight wets themselves, but all of those muscles that you don't think about that are contracting currently in your body, well, if it's life or death, if you live and you wet yourself, that's better than being dead any day. All right, so all of those things start to happen. Once you get to a state of calm, once you get to a place of safety, your pupils will contract. Your heart will start to slow down. Your stomach will turn back on. You'll actually start to stimulate your gallbladder to help increase the consumption of the glucose, and your bladder will contract again. Everything will go back to normal. Notice that many of these things are spinal reactions. They happen instantaneously off a reflex. You don't really get to think and control them. All of this is going to happen. So you get yourself up or you bring yourself back down. All right, so last little review. What were the two major divisions of the nervous system? What is fight or flight? Which division of the nervous system controls fight or flight? And what are the bodily reactions that occurred during fight or flight? You guys have all had them. This is going to be an important thing for you guys to know. Endocrine system. I said that was the last, but this really is the last one. The endocrine system seems like a footnote. You do need to know this one, please, 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 please. So your endocrine system is your hormonal system. It does get activated in fight or flight when we talk about adrenaline being released. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, those are neurohormones. So this is a slower message system. This is going to travel through your bloodstream. Neurotransmitters use electrochemical signals and neurons, which is instantaneous almost and really, really fast. Hormones, slower, take a lot more time. Your pituitary gland is the master gland, and it exists in your brain. So this is the only gland in your brain. It produces things like growth hormone. It controls all of the release of all the other hormones. It's a very important hormone, and it takes its order from an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. Now we'll talk about the hypothalamus when we get into the brain section, but those two ideas need to be tied together. In fact, endocrine system is your hormone system. Pituitary gland is the master gland that lives in the brain next to the hypothalamus. Very, very, very important for you guys to know this. You should have a general idea where the other glands in your body exist. So here you see the hypothalamus, an area of the brain, the pituitary gland also up there in your brain. We know about the thyroid, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and then the sex hormones that come from ovaries and testes. You will not get questions about what does your thyroid do. You will get a question about where is the pituitary gland and what controls it, which would be the hypothalamus. Last review. I apologize for my mistake earlier. This is your last review. What is the name of the hormonal system in your body? Which gland controls all the other glands, and where is that gland located? All right, guys, so you will have a quiz when you come into class on Tuesday. Please be prepared for it. If you have any questions, hit me up on Remind or send me an email and I will try to respond.